more diffused and less concentrated. So what we really want to focus on is the long-run evolution of wealth inequality and what's going to happen in the future. How can we account for the fact that until World War I, wealth inequality was so high and if anything was right.
So this is a TED Talk. You can find it very easily, Thomas Piketty, and it's based on his book, Capital. Which came out several summers ago and was a bestseller. Now notice one of the main books that Karl Marx wrote was called Capital, in German Das Kapital, right? Probably heard of it. The book that Thomas Piketty wrote then was Capital, but in the 21st century, right? An analysis of the nature of capital and what exactly are they really talking about? And when they talk about doing away with private property, they mean that using capital, using wealth in order to make wealth, because it creates this inequality among the very few at the top who have all the wealth and all of the rest of folks who have various amounts of the remaining pie. And this also, of course, means that the people that have all the wealth have all the power in the society. In a sense, when we think of our republic today, we call it a democracy or a representative democracy, but I think everyone might agree that in order to get elected to higher office like senators, presidents, governors, you need a lot of money in order to campaign, etc., right? And so in a sense, it's the rule of the rich, which is part of the problem, of course, that the rich want the government to do what will increase their own wealth. And so the rich are ruling for the rich, not for everyone. So we look at the social contract, what Marx saw in Europe at the time, and this is the Industrial Revolution, right? And everything is really changing drastically in Europe. If we go and look at the video that the BBC put together, I think it's really terrific and shows how that all worked.
5,000 years of Chinese music and dance in one night.
His argument against capitalism was that it was inherently unfair. His ideas on inequality have more resonance than ever today.
What Marx did do is to install this sense of urgency. Things cannot go on forever the way they are.
In this series, I'll tell you about the lives and revolutionary thinking of three extraordinary men: John Maynard Keynes, Friedrich Hayek, and Karl Marx. Their worlds were changing as never before. They saw that the fate of nations would hang on the power of money, and they had radically different ideas about how to control it. Today, the stakes could hardly be higher. All three of these men were giants whose ideas live on. But they speak to us right now because they, more than anyone, recognize the double-edged power of money, how markets could transform all of our lives, but also plunge us into chaos. Keynes and Hayek argued about whether governments should try to tame this force of human nature, capitalism. Karl Marx had the most radical advice of all: get rid of it. Karl Marx's reputation lay in ruins. What a mess. For most of us, the fall of the Berlin Wall meant the end of Marx. Millions rejected the horrors of a violent and repressive police state. And because the communist countries claimed Marx as their inspiration, his ideas were cast aside as well. When this wall came down, I was just studying economics at university. Back then, we thought we knew two things about Marxism, communism. One was it hadn't delivered freedom for the workers, quite the opposite. The other, just as bad if you're an economist, is it hadn't delivered prosperity. The communist approach to the economy just hadn't worked. While the free market West took great strides, the communist planned economies had been left behind. Marx's reputation as an economist was in shreds.
Remember when I was stationed in Berlin, that was 1980, 81 and 82, the opportunity for us to go into the communist zone, because remember we were allies. In fact, I'm not sure why Russia has been thought of as an enemy. We were always allies. There were occasions when we actually fought Russians. During the Russian Revolution, we were on the side of the white Russians as opposed to the Reds. And the Reds were the communists, and the whites were the aristocrats. But the majority of the wars that we've been involved with Russia, we've always been allies. World War I, World War II, etc. Right? So it's kind of interesting. And so we were allies when I was stationed in Berlin, and so we were allowed to go into the communist zone. We had to have our passes, but we could go in and drive around, shop, go to things. We would go to the opera. In fact, I took a busload of colleagues from the field station to the opera. We went, I saw in the advertisements that they were going to have a Russian opera, Prince Igor, which was one of my favorites. And so I invited whoever wanted to go to join me, and we would all go. We ended up with a whole busload of people that went over to listen to the Russian opera, Prince Igor. When we got there and the prelude played, and then they started to sing, they were singing in German. So I still remember 2 rows of soldiers and their wives all turning with military precision, looking down at me, because here I had suggested we were going to listen to a Russian opera, and it was a Russian opera, but they were singing it in German. So my supervisor, I was an E5 at the time, my supervisor, who was an E6, looked at me and said, "Next time you invite us to a Russian opera, make sure it's in Russian." It wasn't my fault, right? How was I to know that the Germans would do it in German? In any case, we got to visit the communist zone, and it was absolutely incredible. The stuff that they had really nice stuff, but very little of it. I remember going to a flower shop, looking at the flower shop to see what they had, and you know what our flower shops are like. Even in a supermarket, you see all sorts of varieties and beautiful flowers and everything. Went into their flower shop, and they had beautiful flowers, but every single vase was exactly the same. The exact same arrangement. So that day you could buy that arrangement of flowers. Didn't matter which one you picked, they were all the same. remember going into a bookstore and shopping for books. And in order to get into the bookstore, you had to wait in line outside the door. And then as someone was coming outside of the store, they would hand the next person in line to go in a basket. And that was basically your ticket to continue going on. But you still were in line, and the line actually snaked its way through the whole store until you exited at the cash register and went out and handed your basket to the next person. And so I'm walking through the bookstore carrying this basket and looking at things. And when you browse in a bookstore, what you want to do is take the book down and look at it. So I took a book down and I was looking at it, but the line kept moving. And so by the time I finished looking at the book and didn't want it, but wanted to put it back on the shelf, I was nowhere near where I could go. And so a clerk offered to take it from me. They knew I was done looking at it, so I handed it to them. And then when I got up to the register, they charged me for it and handed me a copy. So I had selected that one. You know, there was no way to get through the line and not have bought the book that I took down to look at. Pretty annoying. By the way, though, it was actually kind of a neat book. It was a great big propaganda book all about how wonderful East Germany was, full of color pictures and everything. So it was kind of neat to have, actually. But the difference, we weren't allowed to buy food there when we were shopping in East Berlin. But the restaurants were okay. So we could go to the restaurants, and they were very inexpensive. And I should explain the reason why everything was so inexpensive for us was because as allies, they couldn't check us when we went across the border to make sure we weren't bringing East German money with us. And there was a difference between West German marks and East German marks. And the difference was because of the difference in the economies. There was about a 2.5 times value difference, with the West German marks being much more valuable than the East German marks. But the official exchange rate between the East and the West was 1-to-1. And so basically no one really wanted to exchange 1-to-1 because they were losing 2.5 times the value of the marks. But if you were going across the border, you had to exchange it. You couldn't just bring in your own East mark, and you had to exchange them at the going rate, which was 1-to-1 in East Germany, right? But as allies, they couldn't check us, so we could bring in East marks, and so we would change our dollars for West marks, and then exchange the West marks for East marks in West Germany, and then we had all these East marks to carry into East Berlin to spend on things. So basically we were buying everything at 1/10 the value of what the item was. So of course we bought Dresden crystal, we bought my wife's favorite little porcelain ballerina, the beautiful statue, you know, all sorts. Wool blankets, really nice wool blankets for the kids, and leather shoes. My wife bought a whole assortment of leather shoes at incremental sizes, so as the kids would grow up, they would be able to just, already have the shoes available. I remember we bought a great big Cadillac of a stroller for the baby. So we had this great big old, beautiful stroller for the baby. It had a blue canopy with a nice bassinet, and you could take that whole thing off and put a red chair on it, and had an umbrella. It had all sorts of. It was really a Cadillac of a stroller. Totally passé today, of course, compared to the interesting little things that people use today. But it was 450 marks roughly $45 for just an incredible baby stroller. So we had fun shopping there and doing all that stuff, and we were taking advantage of the way that the economy set up. But what it showed me was that their economy was a dismal failure. The people living just on the other side of the wall were really living in the dark compared to the people living on in West Berlin. And West Berlin at night, if you'd ever been there, was like Las Vegas is today. Not absolutely, of course, as tremendous as Las Vegas, but it was like the West showplace. In fact, one of the big stores was the Kaufhaus des Westens, or the KaDeWe, which was basically a great big supermarket, multi-level supermarket with all sorts of products available. And of course, the communists would come into East Berlin to go shopping. And the especially elite would be able to go into West Berlin and get some things and come back. But even by comparison to the kind of impoverished stores that we saw in East Berlin, the other capitals in the communist zone were worse. So clearly, communism wasn't working. And I saw just the other day, I'm sure you're aware that Venezuela is in a miserable situation right now. Venezuela was a communist country, a socialist country, with an attempt to do away with private property in the capital sense. The state took all of the capital, very much like Cuba did years ago under Castro. And they started giving things away, of course, to people. And of course, as you all know, especially when the oil price dropped, and we know what that's like, right? Instead of living in a society that's flush with capital and can spend lots of money on all sorts of resources, and the people don't have to especially earn it, like our permanent fund, right? That goes great as long as you have all that income, but the minute the price drops and all of a sudden it's all gone, just as we've seen with Governor Dunleavy's proposed budget, slashing practically everything. Everyone's all upset and concerned about the disaster that's going to lead the state into. Venezuela's already been there, done that, and they're, of course, at the point now where folks are leaving by the millions, I believe, going into Colombia and things of that sort. And in watching a show just the other day, I saw one of the commentators point out, well, yes, by being socialist, it doesn't work, right? We know that, socialism doesn't work. That's why we have a capitalist system, because that one works, right? So that's basically the conclusion that you see economists will conclude, that thanks to the experiment that Russia engaged in, and China's another thing, but thanks to that attempt starting in 1917 to establish a communist or socialist government based on the theory of Karl Marx, they ended up over 70-some years with a dismal economy that collapsed, as we see with the wall being knocked down in '89, the various revolutions in Russia, and Russia is no longer, of course, the Soviet Union now. So economists are absolutely convinced that socialism doesn't work. And with Thomas Piketty, in his book, Capital, what he also demonstrates, I think, is very depressing, and that is that the very nature of capital is that those with the most money make the most money, and that you end up then with this divide between the haves and the have-nots. That's the way, since records have been kept on the nature of capital, that it's always been that way. And as he was explaining, as they go back in the records, the wealth gap actually was worse before World War I than it is now. But it's moving in that direction. And the reason is that if your life is based on the income that you're getting from your work, you cannot make more money in a sense. And there are some jobs, of course, where you can make a lot of money, but they're odd. They're also very rare. So, for example, the occasional movie star that does really well. Movie actors will tell you that most movie stars, most actors end up working as waiters in restaurants, hoping for a job occasionally, and even if they get one here and there, they're not really doing that well. It's an impoverished kind of position. You might hear the same thing about sports figures. You know, there are those occasional sports figures that do absolutely fantastic. On the other hand, most people in the sports arena are essentially in the same sense as actors, hoping for that big break, but most of the time they're just eking out a living, and they can't do it for very long as well. So what jobs can you get where you can make a lot of money? The wages of the jobs that pay the most, apart from like dentists, which I believe are the highest professional jobs right now, dentists, are the jobs of those who type code for computer programs, because that's one of the main stimulating positions in our economy is selling technical technology, and the folks that make that competitive and work are those that write the code for the software, and those are very challenging jobs. The skill in doing that has clearly identified certain individuals as being the really good ones, and if the company is going to keep its place in the competitive market, what they need to do is keep hiring the best code writers, and so those folks can basically name their price and go from company to company. So that seems to be the job where you can make the most money, kind of routine, at least for a while. But where else can you make money? Investments. But everyone knows in order to invest, what you have to have is money already. Right? And so the problem, of course, then is that in order to grow your wealth, even with a French accent, what you have to do is have wealth already. And the rate of growth, he was pointing out, is higher than G, which is, I forget, what was G? How much you make in income, right? And so if the growth in capital is roughly, he said, around 3%, has been roughly around 3%. That's pretty much the way wealth will grow that way. By the way, I've also read that the really wealthy tend to invest in art. Remember, we were talking about how art, modern art especially, seems absolutely crazy. But if you've invested in the right artwork, 20 years later, that sells way more profitably than any other kind of investments you can make. So that's kind of intriguing. A lot of my friends, by the way, have pointed out to me that real estate is also a great way to make money, and that's by buying apartments and things of that sort and then renting them out. But guess what? That actually is pretty precarious depending on the state of the real estate market and so on. Notice right here in Alaska, a lot of people lost their shirts when the various drops in oil prices, etc., hit because everybody leaves. And as a result, we end up with people losing money in real estate. So basically, having lots of money and having it invested in things like the stock market tend to be the best way to make money. But that, of course, creates this wealth gap that we're seeing and hearing more about. And so Piketty argues very much the way Karl Marx does, but instead of doing away with capital, what Piketty argues is the kind of raising taxes on the wealthy and redistributing the wealth so that by taxing the ones with all the wealth and then taking that money and redistributing it to other people through things like universal income, perhaps, or Medicaid or Medicare or Social Security income and things of that sort. And the big problem we're looking at is with the technologies developing, they're going to replace a lot of the jobs that people get. I've noticed even McDonald's, and I think everybody picks on McDonald's and says, you know, you do all this, you get this college education, et cetera, and then you end up being a clerk at McDonald's, whatever. Well, even those positions are going to go away as McDonald's is replacing employees with, I don't know if you've gone out to the McDonald's at Tikotnu, but when you go in there, you can use your phones to order at the various kiosks in the store instead of going up to the counter, and then just go sit at the table and they deliver your food for you. So there's fewer and fewer employees required in order to run the operation. So that's fewer and fewer jobs for people, right? So that's kind of interesting. Where are we going to go with that? Marx argued for a revolution. Violence was going to have to be the way of it. Strikes me as, did you ever see X-Men Apocalypse? Yes? Kind of like the evil returning god or whatever it was basically kind of like Karl Marx, you know, just tear the whole thing down and start all over again. So what's a good question for today? I need a good quiz question to and the quiz questions I like are the ones that have, I guess you've noticed, that don't have a real answer. They're ambiguous, and they're thought-provoking questions that you... How about this one? What rights do you think governments should ensure everybody has? I mean, we, of course, have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what rights? That sounds like one of my test questions, doesn't it? What rights do you think everybody ought to have? Remember, your rights can be taken away. So if you kill someone, the state can take away your right to life, or at least to liberty. They can put you in jail, things of that sort.